Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, The Future of Network Infrastructure, Secure, Software-Defined, and Automated, sponsored by Leidos, on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today, Stephen Rice, the Deputy CIO at the Homeland Security Department, Beth Cloran, the Deputy CIO at the General Services Administration, Ira Barron, the Chief Technology Officer at the Office of Justice Programs in the Justice Department, and Angie Heisey, the President of the Civil Group at Leidos. At the end of the last segment, we just started to get into a little bit of the data center and how the data center optimization consolidation efforts are really impacting the broader network. And Angie, you had brought up the workforce piece too, and I want to kind of dig into that a little bit, because while the cloud and, I'll make fun of 5G a little bit, and all this is acting as a disruptor to the network, it's really the biggest disruption to the network is probably the workforce changes that how people are going to have to manage, look at, oversee. So Beth, let me start with you, because one of the things that GSA has is both that you've already been through a disruption internally, and now this is maybe a secondary disruption that's happening to the workforce. Talk about how you guys are trying to deal with that from a network modernization.
Yeah, so I think that we have been really working to start down the artificial intelligence path. We actually really have been working to start embracing RPA. A lot of it has been started to be led by our CFO, and having a number of just basic processes that we've been able to automate. We have about 25 different bots already, but we think that over the next couple of years that is going to quadruple in the amount of capabilities. And we also have, both on our Federal Acquisition Service and Public Building Service, they are also starting to build these capabilities, understanding that we have a significant issue with the overall federal workforce and the fact that they are aging, and that when we really want to recruit new folks, we need to be doing work differently, right? For them to be able to be engaged and to really want to work for the federal government. Because I think the young folks really understand the millennials want to be part of our missions. They are really excited about them, but they want to have exciting work. They don't want to be sitting in front of a terminal doing the same thing for the next 30 years. And so we have to think about what that's going to do. So just an example, one of the RPA capabilities that we've already built, we think potentially just that one will save at least 10,000 man years a year. Right? And so if we can save that capability, how can then we reinvest in the current workforce we have and recruit for the new workforce of the future? And so we look to both what private industry is doing and internally to say, where do we need to put some more better data analytics? How do we make sure that we have the right people in the middle to make those decisions on behalf of the government? Those higher tech skills that we need. If you think about how we have traditionally done things across the federal government, I always think of things as threes. There's process, there's people, and there's technology. And the triangle of that has not been equilateral, right? So a lot more of it is on the process and the people side, and then technology has been secondary. It's starting to shift where more technology is taking on, and so we've not need to reevaluate those processes and our people. And there are a number of initiatives, and there are pockets of excellence across the federal government where this capability of recruiting that next set of the workforce, and also making sure that we're looking at our current workforce and reskilling. I think that what the Federal CIO Council did around cybersecurity is a great example of that. They put out an announcement to try to reskill different people to do cybersecurity. These would be people that have no background in technology at all, but would like to try to get into the field. And they thought that they'd get a number of, 100 couple people. They had over 1,500 applicants. And then they did an assessment to say, okay, of the people that applied, who would have an affinity to go there? And they still had, almost a third of the people left. So they have such a pent-up demand. And there are people that do want to change careers. I can tell you personally, if you looked at where my career started and where my career is now, I would have never planned that path, right? But there are going to be changes, there's going to be turns, and we need to make sure that we're looking at our workforce and giving them the opportunity to make those pivots and understand where they might be, so that they can go not only to the technology but pivot to the mission capabilities as well.
And GSA's example of RPA is a great one. I think you guys are you and maybe the Treasury Department are the two that maybe are out in front of a lot of agencies, and RPA seems to be everywhere. But that also has an impact on the network, because each of these bots, if you will, is another Correct. Laptop computers, something to the network, and the network has to be able to handle it. So it's one thing to say, well, Stephen Rice is going to hire 3 more people and we have to have room for them on the network. But if you're going to put in 25 bots or 100 bots, that also impacts the network too. So maybe take me one step further down to the network
piece. If
piece.
you look at the network piece, I mean, this is why I say we have to make it a network that is capable of expanding and contracting, similar to what we're doing with the cloud today, right? Because there are going to be times that you're not going to need more capacity on the cloud. Think of it as energy. We have to start thinking about networks and cloud the same as you would your energy use. On a hot summer day in DC, your energy use is going to be through the roof. On a day that's -0, your energy use is going to be extraordinary. But on a daily basis, it's going to be average. But we have to plan our networks for growth in our communities. We're going to have a lot of growth in the DC area. And so you need to have that trend and what you need to do to make it scalable. But you also need to plan for those surges, because what you don't want is to have the downtime that has the direct impact to the mission. So it's got to have the influx in the times when you need it to be scalable and surge up. And so I think if we start looking at technology more as a consumption-based capability, similar to what we've now done for the cloud, we now need to start being able to apply that to our network, and to make sure that it's reliable and be able to have those spikes when we need them, but know that we shouldn't be paying for this huge amount of capacity all the time if we don't need it. Let's make sure we're planning for the average capacity, but know that we can have those spikes when we need them.
Angie, this consumption model is getting a lot of play again. Is how does the agencies, how does the government turn to more of a consumption model? Are you starting to see that from clients? Are they asking for it, or is it still stuck in that kind of old, like we're going to pay for X, and that's?
No, I think most of our clients are all in some levels of discussion, right? As I said before, I get the honor of working with a lot of different clients, and so they're all different levels of maturity. And we try really hard at Leidos, at least, to try to make sure our organization is incorporating much of what our customers are talking about and the services we want to deliver to them as well. And so the consumption model is something we've had a lot of dialogue, and like Beth, we started with RPA in the CFO shop. We actually named our bots and we scheduled them so that they would work on off hours when a lot of our other employees are not. But I think that consumption model for absolutely every service that we do from a technology perspective will constantly be discussed and then eventually deployed across all of our customer sets.
And Steve, come in, because one of the things about what DHS is doing with the managed service effort is to look at that consumption model, but it's also around the workforce changes too, and as part of this bigger disruption. Tie those two loose ends together for me, the consumption model, the managed services, and the workforce. I guess there's 3 loose ends, I guess, huh?
If you kind of look at the strategy, it's simplifying the architecture for DHS, simplifying the contract architecture. We have a lot of contractual overlaps about how we deliver services today. It's a very complex delivery model. We start looking at the overlap of the workforce, the skill set is changing. And what that is, we're seeing it from 2 areas, from the cyber workforce as well as the compute and storage, typical engineering side of the business. From a security perspective, the automation and the tools that are available are allowing us to have a more robust analyst. We also are looking at each of the devices that are on network as almost intelligent sensors. So there's a lot more information coming across each analyst desk. So it's requiring let's just say, a level of curiosity and problem solving of our analysts to dig a little bit deeper, because of the depth of knowledge as well as where the information is coming from requires that type of, let's just say, disruption of the skill sets and the type of qualities we're looking for in the cyber workforce. When you start looking at it from the traditional compute and storage, where it's traditionally on-prem, you manage your Wintel stack, your infrastructure stack. Now that you're consuming that, making sure that we're retooling the workforce to understand what are the capabilities available in some of the large cloud providers today. And then also level of risk. Because what we're seeing is the availability of the tools that are available in the cloud don't necessarily need to have deep engineering backgrounds to operate. So what we're finding is we're moving individuals and putting in areas to start taking advantages because they're curious, because they're problem solvers, because they understand the level of risk, or they're willing to bend the curve a little bit and move us forward. So it's a recognition of our leadership of how do we ensure that we're putting the right people in challenging opportunities to prepare ourselves for this disruption. And then also making sure that we have one eye moving forward to understand those new technologies that are coming that we may not fully appreciate and understand the level of risk and how they're going to be affecting our mission, but knowing that we have to prepare and retool ourselves in preparation for those.
Ira, Steve brought up risk. Steve also brought up security. So let me maybe pull you into this a little bit, because one of the challenges with this network modernization is this idea of, okay, we want to go to the cloud, we want to use off-prem, you want to go to the Justice Department data center, but that now you have to balance out that risk. And even though you could say, well, Joe Klimovich is my best friend and I trust him 100%, well, wait a minute, now he has my data, and if something happens, my boss will look at me and go, why'd you give it to Joe Klimovich? I don't know this guy. How do you balance that risk security side as part of this network modernization?
Yeah. Much of it is abiding by what Joe asks us to do, which is very useful to us, because we know that we get services, we get certain security protections, we get a variety of beneficial features to following the model that JMD has put in place for us. With regard to the physical data centers, we have a declining footprint in them. We continue to rely on JMD to make sure those data centers stay up and that our databases are running and all of that. But as we migrate out of there, the question really becomes, how then does our relationship with JMD change in terms of the services that we're mandated to continue to use and the ones that we want to continue to use. Our experience so far has been that as we reach out into new cloud environments and established environments outside of our headquarters data center and outside of the core enterprise facilities, the CEFs, we do have obligations to ensure that logs come back, that they're integrated into an overall security scheme. We've had practice now in a couple of cases moving toward bringing external computing environments behind the tick into the network. And we're learning as we go, because again, each vendor, each cloud service provider, each cloud vendor is a little different in what they can offer and how they want to integrate or how they can integrate with the security provisions of the JMD network. If I may, I want to touch a little bit on automation.
Yeah, please.
And there's a corollary to the added load that automation brings to the network, and that is the potential to reduce the load on the network by reducing the number of times a human being, whether an internal federal staff person or a citizen working with their systems, has to touch the system. I had an interesting conversation at a conference some time ago with a woman who leads IT for a large American insurance company. And the question was, of all the cases that come in, and there are millions a year, how many of them require a human being to help facilitate them? And the answer was about 20%. So because these cases come in and they fall within the bounds of what would be expected for someone living in this area, driving this type of car with this sort of traffic congestion, et cetera, and the cost of automobile repairs where they might be, this looks reasonable and it goes through. So therefore, there's a significant reduction on the network demands because no one has to go into the system. It's management by exception at that point. So we're looking at ways of using automation to bring about that reduced friction in terms of how citizens and our staff work with our systems to deliver services. And it's meant that these people who are mission focused, who want to be working on ensuring that our investments, our grant investments, are having the greatest impact, can focus on that instead of focusing on help desk calls to reset passwords, fix a problem with data, et cetera.
That's a great example of the automation piece of and I was surprised when you said 20%. I thought you were going to say like 50% or 80%. But I think that leads us down the path of this discussion on software-defined networking. And let me bring Angie into this discussion because there's a lot of promise around SDN and specifically automation, but also security. And it's still maybe a little early for a lot of agencies, but what are you seeing and what is that promise of SDN when it comes to this discussion of network modernization?
Yeah, so we have one particular client that we've worked with, and I'll use that as an example because it produced some phenomenal results for us. I will tell you what we had to spend the most time working out was what that process was relative to what approvals were needed, how we were going to redo the process now that if it was going to be all software defined. And quite honestly, network projects that previously had taken months to get through, given all the stakeholders' approvals and work that we needed to do, we were able to minimize that down to a couple of days. And it still had the same levels of governance relative to approvals, but it was a completely automated process. And what I've seen is the several pilots that we've done, we've had tremendous efficiencies driven and much better customer responsiveness. But those are on, I'll say, relatively smaller scales right now. And so what we are working with is how are we going to do that and deploy it across what are, quite honestly, some of the largest networks in the world.
And I think the key to this, though, is if you can do the software-defined networking, and as agencies are starting to look and move in that direction, that also deals with security. You see a security problem, it's a software problem now. And it's also the capacity problem. I mean, that's the promise we're talking about here, whether it's a year away from or 5 years from now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I do like the fact that we were able to touch on technology as well as people and processes, because there's so many implications across all three of those, that whether it be security or automation or preparing for the future, there's different skill sets, there's different technologies that are going to need to be applied so that we can ensure that those citizens are getting the most efficient and most protection of our nation's resources.
In many ways, that's what we're all here for anyways, right? Well, at least you guys are. I'm just here to report the news. And in that case, we're going to have to say thank you for your time. This has been just a fascinating conversation. Let me thank my guests. Stephen Rice, the Deputy Chief Information Officer at the Homeland Security Department. Beth Cloran, the Deputy Chief Information Officer at the General Services Administration. Ira Barron, the Chief Technology Officer at the Office of Justice Programs in the Justice Department. And Angie Heisey, the President of the Civil Group at Leidos. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the panel discussion, The Future of Network Infrastructure, Secure, Software-Defined, and Automated, sponsored by Leidos on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Leidos.